Native service members frequently reported being mistaken for the enemy, and Pletnikoff is a good example. I had a heck of a time. Out on the front line, the Americans would get a hold of me and want to kill me and all that. They tried to take me to the provost marshal for impersonating a US soldier. What's the matter with you guys? I'm an Aleut. Stereotypes might not seem to directly relate to our discussion. In reality, the perception of American Indian people as fierce warriors has directly affected their experiences in the military. From the first alliances of Native nations in the colonial era through the Revolution, Civil War, and beyond, the perceived ferocity of Native people has placed them in positions of danger and risk far more frequently than their non-Native compatriots, resulting in Native people shouldering a disproportionate number of casualties compared to other ethnicities. In World War II, we could only make an educated guess why some tribes, such as the Lakota and Dakota, who together have been called Sioux, the Pawnee and other Plains nations, suffered higher casualties than some other Native nations. Sioux service members constituted about 1/5 of the total Native people killed in the war, 100 out of 550. It's not clear whether this is because they were more aggressive or courageous in battle, or whether their commanding officers assumed they had martial talents, so placed them in combat more often. Alison Bernstein, whose book is a foundational work on the topic of Native people in World War II, suggests a third factor, that the high mortality rate might be a result of the Army's tendency to assign those who were less educated to combat units. Dr. William Meadows, whose expertise on code talkers and Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache warrior societies, we have leaned heavily on his work for our publication, has a forthcoming book on the pattern of mistaken identity for Native people in war. Not just World War II, but Korea, Vietnam to today. Meadows has identified 27 cases of mistaken identity for Navajo code talkers alone, and more among other Native service members. Why is this significant? Being reminded of their similarity to the enemy, whether in appearance or political situation, as a war-torn nation, often created empathy and reflection. Why am I fighting for a country that oppresses my people? Am I oppressing others on behalf of that country? What rights will I have once I return home? Though we might immediately leap to blame racism as to why mistaken identity happened during wartime, the issue is more complex. According to Dr. Meadows, during World War II, as well as Korea and Vietnam, groups that had previously not had contact were thrown together in a highly charged situation. In all of these conflicts, both allies and enemies were known to impersonate each other, to infiltrate and gain information. There are documented instances in World War II where white Americans who had never been around American Indians, Asians, or Latino people could not tell them apart. Some American Indians reported that they couldn't always differentiate either. Groups came together during war who had never before been in close contact. In the heat of the moment, service members had to make judgments quickly. A brief story from Dr. Meadows before we move on, as we had a lively email exchange about this topic. He says, after capturing him on Bataan, the Japanese mistook Joe Kayumia, who was Navajo, as Japanese American and beat him until he made it clear that he was American Indian. They later forced him to try and break the Navajo code, but he couldn't. He was captured before the code was formed, had no knowledge of it, and even though he was a fluent Navajo speaker, it was gibberish to him. He also said, Dr. Meadows also said, that while there are racial aspects to how the wars are fought, especially in the Pacific during World War II, once individuals suspected of being Japanese were identified as American Indian, there was no subsequent disdain of any kind, and documented cases where the white Americans even befriended those mistaken points towards misidentification rather than intentional racism. Service members returned home with a new social awareness where they had previously been isolated both physically and culturally. Working alongside non-Native people and being treated as somewhat equal was empowering for many. The return home and influx of Western culture also had a downside, forcing tribes to adapt or reject change. Not all Native communities welcomed change and saw returning veterans and their adaptations to mainstream American society as a threat. Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico, for example, required veterans to go through a cleansing ritual after returning from war, which, by the way, was extremely common traditionally to welcome and ease veterans' return and re-entry into the community.